Hi, my name is Rory. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon and all the bars are closed, so I'm going to drink a beer indoors and show you how I made my track grey. So I'm going to start off here by showing you a project file for a different track. Basically, the method I usually use for writing is I'll kind of write most of the melodic elements first. I'll write some kind of chord progression, some kind of overline melody, whatever, and then I kind of try and fit drums around it, and I go that way. And about this time last year, I decided to try going the other way. So I wanted to write a track, basically drums first, and then try and fit chords and melodies around that instead, just to kind of see what kind of results that would yield. You can actually see the project file is called drums first. And I wasn't really that happy with this track. I didn't actually continue with it. But the drums I was happy with, and if I play it back to you now. Like, you know, it's not terrible. It wasn't something that particularly excited me, but the drums seem pretty good. They kind of had some good stuff to them. No, I was pretty happy with them. So what I tend to do in these situations, if I've kind of got a track that I'm not really happy with, but there's elements of it that I am happy with, is I just kind of make a note of it, and just kind of, if it's a synth I'm happy with, I kind of try and save the patch for it, save the MIDI files. For drums or something like this, I kind of do a similar thing, just try and save the drum rack patches and the MIDI clips for it, or just kind of make a note of where it is so I can drag and drop it into another project, which is basically what I did here. So we can then switch over for the actual project file for Grey, and then start listening to the drums again, and they should sound pretty familiar. I more or less lifted the drums verbatim from the old project, brought them into this one, tuned them to kind of help better complement the melodic ideas I already had in this project. But apart from that, like 80% of the drum work for the drums was done for a completely driven track, basically. Main difference you're probably hearing is there's a sub now. For this track, I process the sub with the kick and the snare. For other tracks, I process the sub separately. There's no right answer, just whatever feels right at the time. I'll run you through how I process my drums generally, and then also specifically for this one. I tend to separate my drums into meat and veg. The meat being the kick and the snare and the clap, all the kind of good stuff really. And then the veg being everything that goes on top of that, the hats, the cymbals, the percussion. For the kick and the snare, what I really tend to use for it is just the Ableton native drum bus. It's just a really quick way of just kind of binding the elements together, adding some distortion to it. You can also use the boom feature as well, just to kind of give the kick just more sub without really getting in the way of the actual sub. Something you've got to be very careful with, especially if you're using sidechaining as well. Otherwise it then just kind of piles up and sounds really messy. And then you kind of switch down to the veg section. It's just an EQ just to slice out the bottom side, which I don't want because I'm getting all that from the kick and the snare and the rest of the track. And then I do sidechain the hats and percussion as well to the kick. It's not really being compressed that much. The ratio is only 2:1, but it's just a subtle way of helping the kick punch through a little more, and just kind of make way basically. And then for the drums themselves as a whole bus, I use RC20 just to kind of put a little distortion on there. There's really not a huge amount going on. It's just something I try and use everywhere because I love it. And then I use Alloy as well, just as a kind of general bus processor. I've kind of got a bunch of my own presets, and then the presets that come with it are actually very good as well, just to help bring the whole thing together. This is the kind of thing you can piece it together individually from Ableton effects. You can just use glue compressor and a saturator. I just kind of prefer how Alloy sounds, so ever since I got it, that's just the way I've done it. But I mean, anything that it does, you can pretty much do with other plugins stuck together. It really doesn't make sense, or it really doesn't make a difference rather. Then we can talk about how the drums are actually arranged, because you've probably seen there's a lot of layers here. Like there's a hat bus, and then there's 3 separate tracks of hats. So this kind of slightly more exciting section fast hats going. It's very sort of drum and bass-ish. So there's kind of a main hat loop, just taking off splice. I then stick some other hats on top of it just to help them pop. That's super simple. There's not a huge amount of velocity shifting going on there. It just kind of sounds like a drum machine. And then there's a percussion layer as well, which is mixed down pretty low. Not super audible when the whole track is playing, but it just helps contribute to the urgency, basically. And then, yeah, you kind of play them all together. They tend to blend in quite well. Especially with these two tracks, like the MIDI hat track and the audio hat track, that's just something I quite like doing. Generally, you kind of have that audio track there as almost like a shadow for the drums that you're programming in. If you're ever kind of surfing around Splice and you find like top loops or things like that, what is quite a cool thing to do is to put it in your mix at like, quite low, like, -30 or whatever, and then put your actual drums on top of it. And it just kind of helps the whole thing stick together. It really gives the mix a lot of cohesion. Always something worth experimenting with. What else? We've got some crashes. It's pretty standard stuff. I think something else I tend to like doing is, instead of using one clap, I layer claps, and then you can see I do like some stereo panning as well, just so it doesn't sound like one clap dead center. There's some width to it. There's some like randomizer on the groove, just so they don't kind of all hit at the same time. There's a little bit of chaos to it. It's the kind of thing you can just draw in yourself if you want, but if you're lazy like me, just drag it in. It gets you about 90% of the way there, to be honest. And then for the sidechain, I don't actually use the kick itself. I have a ghost track. I just have a 909 kick there. I have it adjusted so that I'm only really getting the transient from it, and then everything's sidechained to that, so the kick is completely independent of it. And the advantage of that is also when you're playing through things, even if you've got a sidechain on and the kick is muted, it still comes through. That's honestly the main benefit for me, because it makes it much easier to dial in your sidechains if you don't actually have to have the kick playing while you're doing it. And that's basically all there is to talk about on the drums, so we can switch over to the rest now. So this is keyboard land. So by and large, the keys section of this track was pretty much 100% synthesized. The one exception is this Rhodes piano. Generally include a Rhodes piano in any project I do, but the rest of it, and by and large the most of the Waiting for Bad News record, was synthesized. Obviously I've done tracks before and continue to do so, where I use like my bass or an actual guitar or a piano or something like that. Didn't really do any of that for this record, and especially for this one as well. This is just very synthesized or sampled, so we can kind of run through it top to bottom, and then I'll talk about the processing at the end. So we have this vocal loop. So the only automation I have on that is just some gain automation, just so I can kind of fade it in and out. The main interesting thing about how this is done is basically it's a loop that I've kind of chopped up to kind of help it fit the track better and kind of give it a melody which actually complements everything else. But there's basically two halves to it. There's one half which is at regular pitch, which is panned to, where am I? It's panned to the right. And then there's another one which is pitched 5 semitones down. So basically a fifth up and then an octave down. And then that's panned to the left. So basically what you end up with is this kind of dual pitch effect with the stereo width. Generally, if I'm kind of using any kind of sampled loop, especially with vocals, that's something I will do a lot. It's just a really simple and quite natural way to add some width. And just make the sound generally more interesting and help it cover a wider range of the spectrum. And then in terms of processing on top of that, compress it together. RC20 again, just for some saturation and space. Another echo after it, some OTT. You might be noticing a pattern here. I do some auto panning on it as well. Even though those two tracks are panned right and left, I still take the whole thing and shift it around after that. just so they sit separately, but then I still kind of move them as one. That's the idea of this kind of bus processing, so it still sounds like a single sound. And then the gain automation, which I already talked about. Throughout the rest of the track, it doesn't really do that much. It's quite a simple sound. It just kind of complements everything else, but it doesn't do a lot of the evolving that the rest of the track does. Rhodes piano as well, I already mentioned. I tend to use these in any track that I do. I just find that it's a really easy way to give your track a lot of body. Most of the processing that I do in it, there's kind of a high cut on it. It's just a little bit of compression, a little bit of echo, just things which will kind of nudge it back in the mix, just so it doesn't really take a lot of attention, but it helps prop up everything that's going on around it. So the synthesizers that pile on top of it, they don't really have to worry that much about that kind of midsection, because the Rhodes provides that beef basically straight out of the box. Just kind of help humanize it a little bit, because I just drew in these notes, I didn't play them in. There is the random groove again, which just kind of helps them make sure their notes aren't always hitting at the same time, so it doesn't sound super straight. And then there's the velocity MIDI effect as well, with a little bit of randomization on it. Not a huge amount, you don't want it to sound too clumsy, but basically just if notes are having slightly different velocities on them, it sounds a little bit more natural. The other thing you can do as well, which I've done here, is you can actually automate the velocity output max, which kind of scales the velocities of all the notes here. So you can basically use it to gradually bring it in, not necessarily volume wise, but in terms of how it's being played. It becomes more aggressive the more velocity you give it to it, especially with an acoustic instrument. You can do it with synthesizers as well. You just have to adjust the patch so that it responds to the velocity. And then moving down, this is where kind of most of the sound comes from, apart from the Rhodes. Just a really basic, really simple, really soggy, just wide, detuned saw pad. These are really simple to use, but they're really, really effective. I use them everywhere. It's an addiction. I should get some help, but right now I'm just going to use it. So I mean, we could take a look at this serum patch. Really, really simple. It's just an LFO just to help things move a little bit, just so it doesn't always sound completely flat. But for the most part, we just got these two saw layers. Same again, it's down 5 semitones, so up a fifth, down an octave. No effects on it apart from the processing and Ableton. Like, it's just a really simple sound, but it's really thick. It responds really well to low pass filtering. So we've got this like low pass filter which we're automating here. You can see it bob up and down. So get a really nice variety of sounds there. It's not revolutionary, but I love it. And there's also some LFO automation as well, just so you can get a little bit more of that sort of LFO effect, like you can hear it. It's a little more rhythmic. That was what the LFO, which we saw in the serum patch, was before. But yeah, I think for the most part on that, there's not a huge amount to talk about. The magic of it is the fact that it tends to just play well with everything else. You have to be a little bit careful with mixing it. You can see I've kind of taken a notch out here. Around 400 hertz, just because there's a lot of stuff that kind of piles up in that region, and with these kind of saw pads, there tends to just kind of add a combination of redundant information and muddy information, so just scrap it, we don't need it. And then we can move one further down. We've got this pluck. Very transient, it kind of just comes in and out. And again, that's a really simple sound. Its basis on square waves. The pluck effect basically comes from an envelope for the filter, and then an envelope for the volume as well. There's a phaser on it as well. I find phasers on things like plucks or any kind of transient sort of instrument which doesn't play consistently, like a pad. The appeal of the phaser is basically because it's not a pad, you don't really hear that like gradual shift. You don't hear the phaser like cycle through. You basically just get different points of the effect, which just kind of helps add some variety on it. It just kind of sounds like it's being hit slightly differently each time. It's a very subtle effect. It's one I really like. And then most of the other stuff is basically just about adding space to it. OTT is kind of at a higher dry wet ratio here, basically because we're just kind of happy at crushing that sound, but also it helps really bring the tail out of the reverb and the delay. But like, as with a lot of the plugs that I use, they're just kind of very simple sounds. They're sparse. They basically just kind of help keep things interesting on top. And then one of the kind of most distinctive sounds of this track is that kind of that stab effect, which comes in the third part of the drop. Basically, when I was first doing this track, I still had this third part of the drop, but the main variety in it was coming from those hi-hats, just the fact that it then all kind of starts speeding up. Like I mentioned before, that kind of liquid drum and bass sort of effect. Needed something more, that was where the stabs came in. So, yeah, basically I bring it in towards the end of that second part of the drop, just so you can kind of get an idea of what's coming. It doesn't hit you full in the face, you can kind of see it coming from a distance. You can kind of see the inevitability of it. It's, again, a really simple sound. A lot of the synths that I use tend to be very analog based, very simple, and then I kind of rely on the arrangement and the processing to basically make them interesting. I made use of a lot of LFOs in this just to kind of help give it variety, basically, just so that as you keep listening to it, it keeps doing different things. It just adjusts very slightly. There's a really subtle effects, but they just kind of humanize it a little bit. They help it sound a little more like an analog or an acoustic instrument, and not like a cold digital synthesizer. So, I mean, you know, we're automating things like the buff on the French low-pass filter. I haven't spoken French in years. We kind of adjusting the detuning as well. That's just kind of a nice little effect. Like, that's 4 bars long, so it basically means as we reach the end of measures, we're kind of more detuned. It sounds a little more chaotic. It's kind of quite a cool little transitional effect. This is where most of the actual, like, LFO effect comes from. And, yeah, we're just kind of adjusting little things, but by and large, it's just kind of saw waves into a low-pass filter, not much going on. We automate some flanging as well. I really like kind of just getting a flanger out just to kind of help make that sound more exciting at transitional points. But then most of the rest of the automation just comes from automating a low-pass filter on the bus above it. Basically, the reason these are running through a bus is because the stabs used to be made up of multiple tracks stuck together, and then eventually I just got it all done with one track, and I never bothered consolidating it into one track. So now you have some processing on one track, some processing on a group. That's not a trick. That's just me not being organized. But again, yeah, the processing pretty simple. Just cut the low end out. Added some width to it as well, just because this is supposed to be a more exciting part of the track, so it should fill out the stereo a little more. OTC again a high amount because there's an element that's going up the top end, so I don't really mind if it kind of wipes out a lot of that bottom end and starts sounding a little tinny, because the pads and the Rhodes are kind of doing most of the work there, so I'm letting this one just be a little more ridiculous. I did put it before the delay and the reverb this time, just because I didn't really want that tail. I wanted it to be a little more controlled sound. I mean, like the dry wet of the echo is actually down pretty low. There's not a huge amount of reverb going on in there as well. The RC20 is mainly contributing the distortion. And then, yeah, actually, there's a separate sidechain compressor on this as well. I think I basically use that as just a way of just cutting the notes completely. So as the kick hits, you can see it just cuts those notes completely. Like if I get rid of this, you can see those notes are actually there, but you need that second sidechain compressor to actually get rid of it. And when I say second sidechain compressor, I say second because the first one is on the keys bus. I tend to do as much sidechain compression as I can on a bus. Or generally a lot of the processing I do, I try and do in buses as they are. I think it's kind of beneficial from a mixing perspective. It just helps things stick together. It helps make sure these things don't sound like distinct elements just kind of bodged together at the last minute. If they kind of run through a bus, it helps them sound just more cohesive, more as one unit, like as if they were recorded together in the same room. And then, yeah, apart from that, the drum processing, just kind of quite a sharp filter just to get rid of the low end because we only want the bass doing that, or the sub that we already saw before in the drums. There's a filter effect which I just kind of use just to help bring things in, and then I've also got this rack which I drop in sometimes, this just kind of reverb sweep. It's basically a combination of a low pass filter and a reverb wet dry, and basically if we just kind of find a place where I've used it here, you can just kind of hear how it just helps the signal just wash out a little bit. That one's not that good. Let's try here, there's more going on. It's a subtle effect, although you can get really extreme with it, but I think just by kind of adding that reverb in and just adding the low pass filter onto it as well, it just kind of helps push the whole thing back into the mix. So you kind of transition it from the drop into that sort of breakdown section where we wanted the drums to be a little bit more prominent. And yeah, we just kind of wanted the keys to sound more pushed back, more out of the way. If you listen to some of my other tracks, I do that quite a lot, especially on the first EP I did, and then I just kind of carried that forward. I've always got this rack ready to go. Try not to be too aggressive with it, just because there's already a lot of reverb on this. And then beyond that, like, that's more or less all there is to it with the keys. The only other thing left to mention is just this field recording. Very quiet, it's very subtle. It's just a field recording I got off my trusty little Zoom recorder. I got it in Portola Redwoods when I was camping there last year. I basically just kind of found this rickety little bridge going over this little stream. So I stuck the recorder on there for a few minutes, just kind of recorded the birds and the trees and the wind and the stream. Really liked it and put it on here. And actually I went back a couple of hours after to try and record a little more, and they'd closed off the bridge because apparently it was dangerous, so I probably shouldn't have been there in the first place, but I got a good track out of it, so I'm just gonna let that one go. Only other processing I did on that was just getting rid of the bottom end because I don't need it, and then also just cutting a little off the top end as well. I just kind of find when it gets to the mastering phase, that's basically just hiss, which just kind of really affects the noise ceiling. So I just kind of get rid of it because it's not really contributing that much either. Then just some compression and some reverb, just to kind of help the whole thing stick together and bring it in with the rest of the track. And then a little gain automation as well, just so I can bring it in and out. That's really all there is to it. And that's more or less the whole track, actually. Please let me know if this was useful for you. I think when I was just kind of getting started, track breakdowns were one of the most useful things to me, so I think it's quite important that I start giving back to that now. And just let me know what you enjoyed, what you found useful, what was rubbish, whether I should do any more of these or whether I'm just wasting my time. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Stay safe, stay indoors, don't touch anyone. See you later.